morning. I'm Alan Murray, the CEO of Fortune Media. Delighted to be a part of this conversation. I have spent the last 4 decades really keeping an eye on the intersection between business and society. And I think the changes in the last 5, 6 years are greater than I've ever seen before. So we want to dig into that a little bit more deeply. Companies are being asked to do so much today. I mean, the most dramatic recent manifestation was the 800 companies that shut down their operations in Russia in advance of any sanctions or requirement that they do so. You just had a robust discussion about what companies are being asked to do on the environmental front, which is very dramatic. Also taking on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, inequality, all very different than even just a decade ago. We've got two experts. I'm just a scribbler on this stuff, but we have two real experts with us to discuss it, and I hope I can bring them on the screen here. Shiva Rajgopal, who is the Kester and Behrens Professor of Accounting and Auditing and a Chazen Senior Scholar at Columbia Business School. Shiva, thank you for joining. And Aniket Shah, who's Managing Director and Global Head of ESG and Sustainability at Jefferies Group, and also an Assistant Adjunct Professor at Columbia. That does not look like the real Aniket there.
Hi there. I'm on audio.
You're audio only. Okay, we can live with that. Very good picture,
Yeah.
Aniket. Thank you. Thank you for joining. So let me just ask you first to take this at the highest level. I think everyone understands how dramatically things have changed, how much are being asked of companies in terms of environment, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of other social issues, just at the highest level. And Shiva, you can go first. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, Alan. I think it's an inevitable thing. Whether it's good or bad it lies in the eye of the beholder. And as you know, this is a highly surcharged political conversation. Where I come from is, I go to India twice a year, and the average air quality in any Indian city, any big Indian city, is roughly 300. And as you know, the UN prescribed safe limits are around 40. So sitting in Manhattan seems like an intellectual conversation, but I think in a place like India or maybe the global South, and we don't discuss that enough, it's an existential problem that something needs to be done about this issue. And there are deep challenges, in a place like India. And I had learned this from Aniket. If you regress GDP on emissions, the R square is like 90%, meaning there's a trade-off between the next meal and burning carbon, right? So, I'm not even equipped to deal with such great challenges, but I think something needs to be done. This topic needs to be discussed, and inevitably, in our democracy, there's going to be, divergences of opinion. Eventually, hopefully, we'll get to a better place. Hopefully, I think pushed by consumers as opposed to regulators, because you and I know that the state of politics in the US is it's a bit of a mess. I'm not very optimistic about a carbon tax or strict disclosure rules, etc. Maybe consumers and the next generation of students or millennials will hopefully push change.
But so you're saying, Shiva, that given the mess that is our government, companies have no choice but to take on more responsibility for society, to do things that maybe 20, 30 years ago we thought were government responsibilities?
Well, that's my read. If you go back in history, look at the 2008 crisis, look at the Tea Party movement, and so the general impression was that Congress has a hard time getting anything done, maybe even making daylight savings permanent. That's still stuck, as you know, in the House. So let alone doing something, akin to a carbon tax, which is a huge, huge, huge political lift. Yeah. And remarkably, maybe business is seen as the only grown-up or the adult in the room. And there are challenges, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But to me, it's if it is consumer driven. I mean, look at the whole organic food revolution. 20 years back, we were probably wasn't even a food category, and now it's massive. Maybe that's where the future lies. If consumers switch, businesses will inevitably follow. They have to.
Yeah. Aniket, I gave Shiva a multiple choice question: A, good thing; B, bad thing, and he chose C, inevitable thing. But I'm going to keep trying. Stakeholder capitalism, a good thing or a bad thing?
It depends. The fundamental issue here is that the global economy today is really coming up against some very difficult planetary limits when it comes to climate change. And the transformation that is needed for the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, is something that will require both governments and business and, frankly, consumers to change their behavior. And so if stakeholder capitalism is a way to try to solve a problem, then I'm all for it. If stakeholder capitalism is sort of does what it is doing right now, which is it confuses the role of the state versus the role of the market, I think it could actually set us back. So the way that I always think about these problems, Alan, is that we have to always ask ourselves, what problem are we trying to solve for? Or what sets of problems are we trying to solve for? And we have to be as specific in that identification of problems as possible. And then we can start saying, how do we change the system to solving that problem?
Well,
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean
Go
to
ahead,
interrupt
Alan.
you. Well, I was just going to
No,
ask you
go ahead.
because I think you've raised the two of you have raised a really important point here. You're both agreeing that climate is a problem. I think you're both agreeing that government is in no shape to do the sensible thing, which would be to impose a carbon tax. We now have, geez, I think we're close to 40%, maybe more, of the S&P 500 have imposed their own net zero goals. And you're beginning to see that push down the value chain by some of the big companies like Microsoft and Walmart, who are saying, hey, to get scope 3, my suppliers have to comply as well. So if you want to be my supplier, you have to play this game too. Again, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? You said if it's a way to solve a problem, then maybe it's okay.
It could be okay. I mean, having more disclosure is not a bad thing. I think disclosure is good, but we also have to be honest that the more you disclose something doesn't mean that that issue gets solved or that issue gets managed. You know, they always say, oh, if you don't measure it, it doesn't get managed. Well, right now we're in a world where we think if you disclose something, it gets managed. That's ridiculous. We have much more climate disclosure now than ever before. But global CO2 emissions continue to increase. The fundamental relationship between economic growth and emissions has not been broken. And so I think what's happening right now with the stakeholder capitalism is that we spend so much time talking about the means to an end, but we also have to just ask, how do we actually solve this problem? If it's climate, by the way, it could be inequality, it could be wealth in it. We just have to be very clear about the identification of what issues we are trying to go after. Now, in the ESG world, which is the world I live in, Alan, you know, the ESG investor community has a big challenge with this too. It's not clear what goal they are trying to solve for. Is it, for example, the question of how to solve climate, in which case ESG investing is not the way to do it? Is it, how do I better understand intangibles of a company? Then maybe ESG can help in that regard. And Shiva is the global expert on these issues, so I always say this with respect with him in the room. But the identification of what we're actually solving for is something we all need to do a better job with the stakeholder capitalism space.
Yeah, so I want to come back to intangibles in a minute, but Shiva, I know you've spent a lot of time on the sustainability issue and have written about the SEC rules. Obviously, one of the problems right now with ESG investing when it comes to climate is that everybody can pick their own metric. There's no standardization. Nobody knows how to compare or contrast or know if it's real or just public relations. The SEC is trying to address that massive rule that would dramatically change business accounting. What's your analysis? Is that a move in the right direction?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my inevitability idea. Nobody else is doing anything. So, here's at least an attempt to do something, right? So the usual pushback is that, the SEC is overreaching. So what's the alternative? It should be with Congress. Well, Congress can't get much done. What's the other alternative? It should be with the EPA. Well, there are two lawsuits pending with the Supreme Court arguing that the EPA is overreaching in its own right on other issues. So who else, in some sense, is the? I have to come back to the state of the politics because it's highly intertwined with that, obviously. And the SEC's rules are actually not as stringent as the ones in Europe. Yes, it's a 510-page document, and yes, it's like reading Tolstoy. But it's relatively modest compared to the European rules. They're asking for scope 1 and 2 and 3 in special cases. They're asking for a few things which I'm guessing they'll back off. Line item by line item impact of climate on the income statement. Well, that's huge. And as an accounting professor, I can't but envy the amount of grassroots investor support for climate reporting. I don't see any parallel grassroots support for financial reporting. So climate is probably more important than financial reporting today.
Well, that's a really interesting point. And by the way, I did read the document. It is not Tolstoy, Shiva. I would
you skip the footnotes, Alan. I'm guessing.
But
oh, you mean it's not as entertaining? Okay, that's probably true.
Yeah. Yes, it's not as entertaining or necessarily as enlightening, but it will certainly have a profound change if adopted on the way companies operate. And so, how, as a company, if you're required to disclose all these things, does it then require you to also manage these things? And how do you actually do that when you have an obligation to your shareholders?
I just want to push back a little bit on what Aniket said. I mean, why do you wear a Fitbit? So that if you don't put in your 8,000 steps or 10,000 steps, you go for a walk in the evening. Measurement does change behavior. Now, I agree with Aniket that measurement by itself will not change behavior completely, but it's the zero order action that one should consider taking before anything else. And at some level, it's going to be innovation, right? That's the only way things will change. We need to give people an alternative to fossil fuel. We keep harassing oil companies, arguably, but they're not selling drugs. They're selling stuff that we need. So unless as a consumer I have an alternative to, say, even cooking gas, for instance, why would anybody switch? So it has to be focused on, solutions directed at the consumer. Now, the question that you asked, Alan, will this change corporate behavior? It certainly would. It'll also encourage more greenwashing. So if we exempt scope 3, it's a matter of time before scope 1 and 2 get reclassified. I often tell my MBA class that if you make people report CEO shoe size, they'll just go find taller CEOs. Anything that gets measured will get managed. But is that a second order cost or a first order cost of getting closer to a better policy?
And so scope 3 is massively complicated. How can you be held accountable for what your suppliers do and what your consumers do? But on the other hand, if you don't do that, it's fairly easy for a company to say, we'll just push the dirty stuff off on somebody else so it doesn't show up on our books. So you really have to do scope 3, don't you, if it's going to be real?
Yeah, exactly. But will it survive a legal challenge? That's the other issue. I'm a lawyer, but my guess is that it'll go the way of the conflict minerals rule. If you remember, there was a rule a while back where companies had to disclose materials, etc., that they sourced from certain African countries which were at war. Eventually, the SEC backed off, and then it didn't get enforced. So if the rule goes the same way, my guess is that the ISSB or some European entity would effectively become the de facto standard setters for at least the big US companies.
Aniket, we could talk about the SEC sustainability rules all day, but you brought up intangibles. I think you're thinking primarily of human capital. I wouldn't be surprised if we see another rule out of the SEC this year requiring some level of disclosure of diversity and equity. Is that what you're thinking of? And again, is that a good thing, a helpful thing, a doable thing?
Yeah, look, I think again, I have learned so much from Shiva's academic work in this space, so it's always funny to speak about him with him in the room. But the reality is that investors invest in companies with very little understanding of what the companies actually do. It's remarkable, actually, just the lack of disclosure of core aspects of these institutions that you are putting your retirement into, your retirement savings is remarkable. And so the more information that gets disclosed around the things that drive a company's value, which for me, highest on that list are the employees that work there and the technology that they are investing in, that they're producing. The more information that is forced from companies on that, I think the better we can be from an analytical perspective. I sit here within a research I sit here within a research team at a major investment bank, and I see that when this information gets disclosed, when employee turnover information gets disclosed, when employee engagement information gets disclosed, analysts can understand companies better. Is there a one-to-one relationship between employee engagement and a return on invested capital? No, but you won't find that relationship with anything. It just helps you better understand the institution that you are investing in. And so we're very interested in how very practically companies can be better disclosing on this information, and investors developing a framework to make it part of their investment decision making, Alan. And it's something that the investor community is very eager to get smart on, but disclosure is a big problem.
It sounds like you're more interested in human capital disclosure than you are in climate disclosure.
I think that's right. I think, for me, having studied and worked on climate for the last 15 years, and, you guys read the SEC disclosure. I didn't read the whole IPCC Working Group 3 report, but I read many chapters of it. It's really worth just taking a moment and seeing what is the collective, consensus of thousands of the world's leading scientists saying is needed for us to get on top of climate. These changes are so profound that, yeah, sure, disclosure, fine. Like, I don't care, disclose it. Like, okay, now you know your scope 1, 2. Let's give scope 3. It is at, 3 orders of magnitude off in terms of the actual change that's needed in technology, in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of the speed of policy changes for us to live within our planetary boundaries. And so that's why I'm okay. I'm fine with more disclosures around climate data. I just don't want anyone to fool themselves into thinking that collectively that is going to accelerate at any meaningful level action on climate.
Yeah, got it. Hey,
so Alan, I can't let this go. So give me 30 seconds to talk a little bit about reporting and intangibles.
Sure,
so just as a story, so I'm kind of coaching my daughter to take a high AP econ exam. Okay, this is a high school student, and if you look through an econ textbook, what do we teach kids? Elasticity, demand, supply, consumer surplus, producer surplus, cost curves. You try to implement that for any real company, it's virtually impossible. So the point being, value gets added by some combination of materials, labor, which we may call human capital, capacity, managerial talent. You take that framework to a modern income statement, it's impossible to get straight answers to any of that. And we call this, whatever we don't know, under the broad rubric of something called intangibles. So the reporting model needs radical reform. Going back to my earlier point, climate's good, it's important, but bread and butter issues, we have a 6-line income statement, highly opaque, but we put out 200, 300 pages of the 10K and proxy statements. There's a lot of information overload of the wrong kind. If I ask you how much does Netflix spend on labor costs, I don't think you would know, for instance. As basic as that. A high school econ textbook is not implementable in the case of a real company. That's the problem with reporting. And you can call that
Yeah.
unknown big blob intangibles.
And that big blob has grown from someone did some interesting research, Shiva, I'm sure you're more aware of it than I am, that showed that if you go back 50 years, 80+% of the stuff on the balance sheets of S&P 500 companies was physical capital. It was plant, equipment, inventory on the shelves, oil in the ground. And as you say today, 85% plus is intangibles. We don't really have a very good sense of what those things are, but we do know they're tied to people, right? The importance of human capital has clearly catapulted over the last 5 decades.
No, absolutely. If you're asking me,
Yes.
it's R&D mostly. It's it's systems. It's information technology. It's processes. It's managerial nips and tucks. Small managerial processes can sometimes add a lot of value. You can call it whatever you like, organizational capital. Don't forget, Alan, that we've also outsourced most of our production to Asia. That's where the PP&E has gone effectively. It's, Apple's PP&E is sitting on Foxconn's books because of
Yeah.
outsourcing.
Yeah.
Increasingly, we are also seeing muscle-light companies like Hilton and Marriott who basically keep the labor somewhere else. So your muscle-light, your asset-light, by definition, the PP&E is basically gone.
Let me ask you both, and Aniket, I'll start with you, but we're talking about human capital, better disclosure, climate, better disclosure. A lot of these things push you in the direction of a long-term focus instead of a short-term focus. We all know that there are tons of things companies can do in the short term that will increase their profit, but not be good for their people, not be good for the climate. It's not hard to think of hundreds of ways that companies can travel that path. But in the long term, everything tends to converge, right? In the long term, if you, and I guess this is your point, Aniket, if you abuse your people, if you abuse the climate, you're going to end up without people or in a burning world, and your company will not succeed. So is part of what we're talking about here just getting companies to focus on the longer term?
It is.
And
It is. It's funny. I actually have. It's so funny, this question about long term versus short term, because, as you know, an investor is discounting all the future earnings of a company to today. And 80-90% of a company's value, and if you just do a simple DCF valuation of a company, is its terminal value. It's earnings beyond year 10 or 15 that you're modeling. It's everything else and that you discounted today. And so that's where there is pure alignment, frankly, with this whole ESG crowd and the way financial analysis happens. If you're a financial analyst, you should be asking, in year 55 from now, how is this company going to be operating? What is its earnings going to be? What is its long-term growth prospects? And the decision of what number you put in that terminal value will drive your view about the company's value today. So in that way, it is absolutely about the long term. I think the challenge here is not that we don't have the analytical frameworks to do that. That is literally in the, Shiva is teaching his daughter first year macro. This is first year finance or first year accounting. It's simple stuff. The issue though is these things are hard. They're really, I'm now of the view that actually making real changes on human capital management, on improving your corporate culture, on creating an inclusive work environment, on decarbonizing your business operations. These things are just hard. They're very hard to do. And until recently, there hasn't been any incentive to get it done. That is changing now. So yes, we need folks to think about the long run. Absolutely. But it's also, we need, frankly, people to become better operators, better execution folks when it comes to actually getting these things done. And I think that's where we are now.
I have one last question for both of you. We're about to run out of time here, but we've had this conversation for 25 minutes now. We really haven't talked at all about politics. And yet, many of the companies that are moving in this direction, that are adopting net zero plans, that are adopting aggressive diversity, equity, inclusion programs, are starting to get pushback from people who say they're woke CEOs trying to play a political game. It's most noticeable on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, but that's not the only place it's noticeable. So how do you do these things, which both of you have acknowledged are in the long-term interest of the companies, without getting caught up in nasty political debates? Shiva.
So if I may go back, Alan, to the earlier point, the short-termism, long-termism issue, and I'll try and address your question in conjunction with that. I think we have both, short-termism and long-termism simultaneously in markets. So the idea that somehow everybody is myopic is not true. Quite a few people are. That's what the whole literature on accounting and earnings management tells you. There are also companies like Amazon, which have probably hung around for 20 years and 30 years. Some of them, frankly, haven't even repaid their IPO price. So we ran a paper where we looked at, what happens to all the IPOs since 1975. Significant number of firms haven't repaid their IPO price in terms of fundamentals. So you have both simultaneously. It's the first thing to get out in the open. The second idea, Aniket's point that it's all terminal value, is 100% true, except nobody knows how to verify any of that. So I usually call terminal value-based valuation fate-based valuation. You're hoping and praying, and I'm increasingly worrying, are we exchanging pieces of paper without the claims underlying these pieces of paper actually realizing in cash? Now, your point about the so-called woke issue. So, this is again, no conversation about ESG would be complete without going back to Milton Friedman, right? And the Friedman paper or the article basically says that if these two things converge, if your stakeholder interest and shareholder interest converge, there's no problem, right? I mean, if keeping employees happy leads to more productivity, well and good, let's do it. So perhaps the concern of this, people who accuse companies of being woke is if these two interests don't converge, then how do you decide between the shareholder and the stakeholder? And all the work I have done, I don't even find a lot of evidence showing that CEOs indeed are quote unquote woke in terms of burning cash flows. By and large, they take decisions where these two interest groups' interests actually converge. When they diverge, they still do what is right for the shareholder.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Shiv. It makes lots of sense. Aniket, thoughts?
Yeah, my view is simple on the political part. The expectations on CEOs, Alan, like you started this discussion at the beginning, they have changed. And whether we like it or not, CEOs have to be involved in these types of conversations. It is being demanded of them by employees. Forget about shareholders. It's demanded of them from their employees. And so this is a very real, it's a very palpable thing. And it's just something that we're going to have to navigate. And I think what CEOs, the one thing that I would ask them to contribute in a moment of deep polarization is, as pragmatists, which most CEOs are, to help us all understand there is more commonality than differences in our country and in the world. Yeah. And if we don't use, instead of talking about woke capitalism, we say, actually, CEOs of companies, they're all trying to do things in a way that's good by their people and for the planet. And I think as much as they can push a centrist, moderate discussion and agenda in our lexicon, I think that we'll be better off for that.
A great point to end on, Aniket. I mean, what distinguishes most CEOs from most politicians is that they are pragmatists. They're solving problems, and that's what has got us to this unusual position in society. Great conversation. Let me thank you both for taking the time to do it. Appreciate your candor.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Aniket, for doing this.